The Origin Story of America, Birth of a Continent and a Nation. A note to the listener. Good evening. You are about to hear a historical narrative, the compelling story of the birth and rise of the United States of America. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let the history unfold. Let us go back far beyond the stars and flags to the very beginning, when the land itself was being born. The birth of a continent. Long before the name America echoed through history, this land was silent, shaped by fire, ice, and time. Over 100 million years ago, titanic forces deep beneath the Earth's crust tore apart the supercontinent of Pangaea. From the molten chaos emerged a new landmass, the ancient core of what would one day become North America. Glaciers carved mountains, rivers found their paths, and forests began to grow. This was nature's canvas, raw, vast, and untouched by man. For tens of thousands of years, animals roamed freely across this wilderness. Mammoths, saber-toothed cats, giant bison. Then came humanity. Around 15,000 years ago, small bands of nomadic hunters crossed a frozen bridge of land, the Bering Land Bridge, connecting Asia and Alaska. They did not know it, but they were the first people to set foot on a continent that would one day change the world. The first peoples of the land. Over centuries, these early settlers spread across mountains, plains, and forests. They built homes, communities, and spiritual systems deeply tied to nature. From the Inuit of the Arctic to the Mayans of Mesoamerica, from the mound builders of the Mississippi Valley to the Navajo and Iroquois nations, this land was not empty. It was filled with vibrant cultures, languages, and civilizations. They lived in harmony with the land, guided by respect for the sun, moon, wind, and rain. They did not seek to conquer the earth, but to live as part of it. They told stories of spirits and ancestors, of great hunts and sacred mountains. Their wisdom would later echo through centuries, as a reminder of what was lost and what endures. The Age of Discovery. The silence of the Old World was broken in 1492. A man named Christopher Columbus, sailing under the flag of Spain, crossed an ocean and reached the Caribbean islands. He thought he had found Asia. Instead, he had stumbled upon a new world, one that would ignite a wave of exploration, conquest, and colonization. Within a century, European empires, Spain, France, England, and others, began to lay claim to the vast lands of the Americas. They came seeking gold, glory, and God. Ships arrived filled with explorers, missionaries, and soldiers, and behind them followed settlers, merchants, and dreamers. The native peoples who had lived here for millennia faced a storm unlike any they had ever known. Disease, displacement, and war. This collision of worlds would forever change both sides of the Atlantic. The seeds of colonization. By the early 1600s, England began establishing permanent colonies along the Atlantic coast. In 1607, Jamestown, Virginia, became the first lasting English settlement in North America. The Pilgrims followed in 1620, landing at Plymouth Rock aboard the Mayflower, seeking freedom to worship God in their own way. These were humble beginnings, small wooden houses, harsh winters, and uncertain futures. But they carried within them the seeds of a new civilization. 13 colonies grew, each unique, each wrestling with questions of faith, survival, and identity. They built towns, farms, and trade routes. They fought against hunger, cold, and the native peoples they often misunderstood. Yet through struggle, they began to develop a sense of unity, a belief that they were something different from those who had sent them across the sea. The spark of revolution. By the mid-1700s, the colonies had prospered, but tension grew between them and their mother country, Britain. The Crown imposed taxes and laws from across the ocean, the Stamp Act, the Tea Act, and more, without giving the colonists any voice in Parliament. The cry rose, no taxation without representation. Protests turned to anger, anger to defiance. On a cold December night in 1773, patriots disguised as Native Americans boarded ships in Boston Harbor and dumped British tea into the water, the Boston Tea Party. It was an act of rebellion that set the world on fire. Soon after, gunfire erupted at Lexington and Concord in 1775, the first battles of the American Revolution. The colonists, ordinary farmers and craftsmen, took up arms against the mightiest empire on earth. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but not outwilled. The birth of a nation. On July 4, 1776, delegates gathered in Philadelphia to sign a document that would forever change history. the Declaration of Independence. Written by Thomas Jefferson, it began with words that still echo through time. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. With these words, a new idea was born, that government should exist not to rule over people, but to serve them. That liberty was not granted by kings, but was the right of every human being. For 8 long years, America fought for that promise. Led by George Washington, the Continental Army endured brutal winters, hunger, and near defeat. But in 1781, at Yorktown, they achieved victory. Britain surrendered. A new nation had taken its first breath, the United States of America. Building the Republic. Winning freedom was only the beginning. The next challenge was building a government that could hold 13 independent states together. In 1787, in the same city where independence had been declared, the U.S. Constitution was written, a blueprint for democracy that balanced liberty with law. Washington became the first president in 1789. Under his leadership, the young nation found its footing. The Capitol was built, the economy stabilized, and the dream of a republic took shape. Yet the founders knew this was an experiment, fragile, imperfect, but full of hope. The expansion of the frontier. As years passed, America began to grow, westward across rivers, mountains, and plains. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 doubled the size of the country. Explorers like Lewis and Clark journeyed into uncharted lands, guided by the native woman Sacagawea. Settlers followed, farmers, gold seekers, and families chasing the promise of a better life. But this expansion came with a cost. Native nations were pushed from their lands, forced to walk the trail of tears. The soil of the New World was rich, but it was soaked in sorrow and struggle. Still, the American identity continued to form, built on ambition, courage, and contradiction. The struggle for equality. By the mid-1800s, the nation faced its greatest moral crisis, slavery. In the southern states, millions of African men, women, and children were enslaved to build an economy of cotton and tobacco. In the north, abolitionists cried for freedom. The conflict deepened until in 1861, America went to war with itself, the Civil War. It was brother against brother, North against South. For 4 years, the land was drenched in blood. Over 600,000 lives were lost. But in the end, the Union triumphed and slavery was abolished. President Abraham Lincoln, who gave his life for the cause, spoke words that defined a nation reborn. That government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. A new century, a new power. After the war, America began to rise with unstoppable force. Factories roared. Railroads stretched from coast to coast, and immigrants poured in from every corner of the world. Italy, Ireland, China, Germany, each bringing dreams of freedom. The Statue of Liberty stood tall in New York Harbor, whispering, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." The 20th century saw America face new challenges. 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and the fight for civil rights. Through struggle and sacrifice, it became a beacon of democracy, science, and human spirit. Men walked on the moon. Voices like Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of justice and equality. And despite all its flaws, the American experiment endured. The legacy and the promise. Today, the story of America is still being written. It is a story of contradictions, freedom and inequality, prosperity and struggle, unity and division. Yet beneath it all, there remains a common dream, the belief that no matter where you begin, you can shape your own destiny. America was never meant to be perfect. It was meant to be possible, a living idea that freedom, though fragile, is worth fighting for. And so, as the sun sets behind the mountains and the flag waves in the wind, the spirit of the first settlers, the revolutionaries, and the dreamers lives on. A nation still searching, still striving, still believing. This is the origin story of America, not just of land and borders, but of ideals, of courage, and of the unending pursuit of a more perfect union. A journey beyond ice and time. Imagine a world frozen in silence. The year is not written in any calendar, and the earth itself is locked in the grip of a great ice age. Massive glaciers stretch for miles, swallowing mountains, freezing rivers, and blanketing continents. This is a time before civilization, before nations, before names, Kanadan, when humankind was still discovering its courage. Far to the northwest, where Asia meets the Arctic, a narrow land bridge connects 2 vast worlds, one known, one waiting to be found. This was the Bering Land Bridge, a frozen corridor of hope, stretching nearly 1,000 miles between Siberia and Alaska. And across this icy expanse, the first footsteps of a new chapter in human history began. The Great Migration begins. Around 15,000 to 20,000 years ago, bands of hunter-gatherers in eastern Siberia followed herds of mammoth, reindeer, and bison across the tundra. They were not explorers, and at least not intentionally. They were survivors, driven by hunger, curiosity, and instinct. Their eyes, hardened by the cold, looked upon a horizon that had never before known human presence. The world they entered was harsh, yet alive. The skies were painted with auroras. The frozen winds carried the cries of wolves. Each footstep upon that icy bridge echoed into eternity, as these travelers unknowingly became the first Americans. They carried with them stories, tools of stone, fire for warmth, and hope for tomorrow. They didn't know that their descendants would one day fill 2 continents, from the Arctic Circle to the tip of South America, shaping 1,000 cultures, 1,000 languages, and a world beyond imagination. Life on the edge of the ice. The journey was not swift. It took generations. Children were born along the way, tribes divided and reunited, and knowledge passed through stories told by the firelight. They hunted mammoths and giant bison, fished through ice holes, and crafted shelters from bones and hides. For them, the Bering Land Bridge was not a crossing, and it was home. They lived there for centuries, waiting for the glaciers to melt and open new lands further south. Theirs was a life of adaptation and courage. To survive in that endless white, they learned to read the wind, follow the herds, and respect the spirits of the land. Even as temperatures fell to impossible lows, they pressed on, believing that somewhere beyond the snow lay a world of abundance. That belief, that faith in the unseen, was the spark that would ignite the story of the Americas. The new world awaits. As the earth began to warm, glaciers retreated and the Bering Land Bridge slowly disappeared beneath rising seas. The path that had once united continents was gone forever, drowned under what we now call the Bering Strait. But the people who had crossed it, the ancestors of today's Native Americans, had already begun to spread across the new continent. They moved southward into the open plains and forests, following rivers that led to fertile lands. They learned to hunt the buffalo, gather fruits and roots, and craft tools that fit their new environment. The Arctic people adapted to the cold tundra and icy seas. Others, moving farther south, discovered green valleys, deserts, and mountains that seemed to touch the heavens. Everywhere they went, they left signs. Stone spear points buried in soil, cave paintings hidden from time, and legends whispered from one generation to the next. The rise of early American cultures. As centuries turned into millennia, these scattered tribes grew into distinct cultures, each shaped by the land they called home. In the vast plains, people followed the rhythm of the migrating herds. In the forests, they built wooden lodges and canoes, mastering the rivers. In the deserts, they carved homes into cliffs and learned to store water for seasons of drought. Agriculture emerged in the fertile regions of Central America. Maize, beans, and squash became the foundation of early civilization. From those seeds would rise powerful societies, the Olmecs, Mayans, Aztecs, and later the Inca in the far south. But even long before these empires, the spirit of the first migration lived on, a spirit of resilience, adaptation, and discovery. The land that remembered them. Long before the names America, Canada, or Mexico were ever spoken, this land was already ancient with stories. The mountains, rivers, and canyons had seen the footsteps of its first children. Their presence shaped the soil, the forests, and the language of the wind. When we walk through the tundras of Alaska or the plains of Montana today, we are treading on the memories of those who came before, the original discoverers of this continent. Their journey across the ice is not just a chapter of migration, it is a chapter of human courage, proof that survival is written deep in our bones, echoes of the ancestors. Archaeologists still uncover traces of their lives, arrowheads carved from obsidian, tools made from antler and bone, ancient footprints preserved in mud. Each discovery whispers the same message. We were here, we endured. From the Clovis points of New Mexico to the remains of ancient camps in Alaska, science continues to confirm what legend long held true, that the Americas were born not through conquest, but through migration, endurance, and faith. And the descendants of those first travelers still live today: the Inuit, the Cherokee, the Navajo, the Lakota, and countless others, each a living echo of that original crossing. The meaning of the journey. The story of the Bering Strait crossing is more than a migration tale. It is a reflection of what it means to be human. To leave behind the known in search of the unknown, to risk everything for survival, to follow a horizon that promises nothing but possibility. Every nation, every civilization begins with such a moment, when people decide that fear will not stop them. For the first Americans, that decision shaped the destiny of continents. Their legacy reminds us that the roots of America go far deeper than 1776, deeper than any flag or frontier. They go back to the rhythm of footsteps on frozen ground, the beating of hearts in the dark of an endless winter, and the spark of human will that refused to die. The vanishing bridge, the eternal memory. When the Ice Age ended and the oceans rose, the Bering Land Bridge vanished, swallowed by the sea. But the memory of that crossing never disappeared. It lives in every mountain name, every tribal story, every song sung to the spirits of the earth. The ancient travelers did not know what America would one day become, but in a way they created it. For in their courage to cross the impossible, they laid the foundation for everything that followed. Every tribe, every culture, every dreamer who ever called this land home. So when we speak of the origin of America, let us remember, its first chapter was not written with ink and paper, but with footprints upon ice. Closing reflection. Close your eyes for a moment. Hear the sound of the Arctic wind. See the stars glinting on the frozen bridge of land that once linked two worlds. And imagine those first travelers, faces lit by firelight, eyes fixed on the unknown, stepping forward into history. That step, quiet, cold, and full of hope, was the first heartbeat of a continent. The beginning of everything that would come to be known as America. European arrival, Columbus's misguided journey. Prologue, a changing world. It was the late 15th century, an age of kings, empires, and restless seas. Europe stood at the edge of a new dawn. Empires like Spain and Portugal ruled the waves. Trade routes to India and China were lifelines of gold and spice. But the known world was small, bounded by myths, monsters, and maps that ended in oceans. The Mediterranean was crowded. The Silk Road, once the artery of world trade, had been choked by war and Ottoman control. Gold, silk, and spices from the east were growing scarce. And so a question began to whisper in the courts of Europe. Was there another way to reach the riches of the East? Among the dreamers and navigators of this age was an Italian sailor, ambitious, stubborn, and filled with divine conviction, Christopher Columbus. He believed the world was smaller than everyone thought, and that by sailing west he could reach the East. He was wrong, but in that mistake history would be rewritten forever. The dream and the doubt. Columbus was born in Genoa, Italy around 1451, a time when maps were filled with imagination more than accuracy. From a young age, he was obsessed with the sea. He studied winds, tides, and ancient geography. He read the works of Ptolemy and Marco Polo, convinced that the distance between Europe and Asia across the Atlantic was short. But when he presented his idea, to sail west across the Atlantic to reach India, scholars and kings laughed. They said the ocean was endless, that no ship could carry enough supplies to make the journey, that dragons and storms guarded the edge of the world. Yet Columbus persisted. For nearly a decade he knocked on royal doors. Portugal, England, France, and all said no. Finally, he turned to Spain, where King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, newly united under Christianity after centuries of Moorish rule, saw in Columbus's dream both wealth and divine mission. In 1492 they gave him their blessing, and 3 small ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. The voyage into the unknown. The morning of August 3, 1492, dawned bright over the port of Palos de la Frontera. Sailors crossed themselves, families wept, and Columbus raised his eyes to the horizon. With about 90 men, he set sail into the great Atlantic, into waters where no European had ever ventured so far west. For weeks they sailed under blazing sun and endless blue skies. The ocean stretched without end, waves, wind, and silence. As days turned into nights and nights into terror, fear grew among the crew. They whispered that the world might truly be flat, that they would fall off its edge. Mutiny was close, but Columbus, unyielding, calmed them with faith and promise. "Hold fast," he said, "for God is guiding us." Then on the night of October 11th, 1492, as the moon glimmered over calm seas, a sailor named Rodrigo de Triana shouted from the Pinta, "Tierra, tierra, land." The next morning they saw it, green shores, white sand, and people watching them from the beach. After more than 2 months at sea, they had found land. Columbus fell to his knees, kissed the ground, and thanked God. He thought he had reached the outer islands of Asia, but he was standing in the Bahamas in the doorway to a new world. The meeting of two worlds. As the Europeans stepped onto the sand, they met the first inhabitants of this new land, the Taino people. They were gentle, curious, and welcoming. They wore gold ornaments, which immediately caught the sailors' eyes. Columbus wrote in his journal, "They are loving people. They would make fine servants, and with 50 men we could subjugate them all." It was a chilling prophecy. To Columbus, these people were not equals, they were subjects. He believed he had reached the Indies, and so he called them Indios, a name that would cling to indigenous peoples for centuries. The Taino greeted the newcomers with food and gifts, not realizing that their generosity would mark the beginning of their end. Within a few years, their islands would be transformed by conquest, disease, and greed. The return and the deception. Columbus returned to Spain in 1493, bearing tales of exotic islands, gold, and docile natives. He carried parrots, fruits, and even a few captured Tainos to present before the royal court. Europe erupted with excitement. The king and queen hailed him as Admiral of the Ocean Sea. He was promised more ships, more men, and more authority. Columbus believed he had reached the edge of Asia. He called it the Indies. But others began to doubt. Cartographers soon realized he had found something entirely different. A land unknown to Europe, Africa, or Asia. A new world. Yet in his pride, Columbus never admitted it. He died believing he had found a western route to Asia. The shadow of exploration. With Columbus's return, the floodgates opened. Spain, Portugal, England, France all sent expeditions across the Atlantic. Each voyage carried priests, soldiers, and dreams of empire. But behind the shimmering words of exploration lay a darker truth: conquest. Within decades, indigenous civilizations that had thrived for thousands of years were shattered. Diseases like smallpox swept through villages, wiping out millions who had never known such sickness. European weapons and slavery destroyed entire cultures. The Spanish conquistadors, following Columbus's path, marched into the heart of the Americas. Cortés in Mexico toppling the Aztec Empire. Pizarro in Peru defeating the Incas. Gold and silver poured into Europe, fueling its renaissance. But it was blood that paid the price. The myths and the misunderstandings. For centuries, schoolbooks celebrated Columbus as the discoverer of America. But how can one discover a land already filled with nations, languages, and civilizations? To the indigenous peoples, the arrival of the Europeans was not discovery. It was apocalypse. Entire worlds were erased, temples burned, knowledge lost, children enslaved. The Taino, who had once welcomed the strange visitors from the sea, vanished within decades. And yet, this painful collision of worlds gave birth to the world we know today. A tangled legacy of destruction and creation, faith and greed, light and shadow. The Americas became a meeting ground of continents, a crucible where cultures clashed and merged. The Age of Empire. As the 1500s unfolded, European ships swarmed the Atlantic. Spain claimed vast territories in the Caribbean and South America. Portugal colonized Brazil. France explored the northern rivers. England settled along the eastern coast. Colonial powers carved the map of the New World as if it were empty, drawing borders across lands they barely understood. They brought Christianity, iron, and gunpowder, and demanded gold, sugar, and slaves in return. The once pristine lands of the Taino, Arawak, and Carib peoples became plantations and ports. New diseases, new gods, new languages, and everything changed. And in that transformation, the old world of the indigenous peoples began to fade into memory. Columbus's legacy, a continent transformed. Columbus's mistake, thinking he had reached India, reshaped the course of human history. Because of him, Europe turned its gaze westward. Nations rose and fell on the riches of the New World. Slavery, colonization, and trade turned the Atlantic into a highway of both hope and horror. The Columbian Exchange and the vast transfer of plants, animals, and ideas changed both hemispheres. Potatoes, corn, and tomatoes flowed east to Europe. Horses, wheat, and smallpox flowed west to America. The balance of the planet shifted, and in ecosystems and economies and power. And somewhere beneath all of it lay the quiet memory of the first handshake between the Taino and the sailors from across the sea. The first meeting of two worlds that would never be the same again. The man behind the myth. History has judged Columbus in many ways as a visionary, a hero, a villain, a fool. The truth is complex. He was a man of his time, devoutly religious, dangerously ambitious, and often cruel. He enslaved indigenous people, punished dissent among his own men, and claimed divine authority for his actions. Yet his voyage marked the beginning of global connection, the moment when the continents of the world became one story. In that sense, Columbus was both the creator and the destroyer, the one who opened the door and unleashed the storm. Epilogue: the dawn after the storm. In the centuries that followed, the world Columbus accidentally unveiled would give rise to nations, revolutions, and dreams of freedom. But before America could be born, it had to be found, and before it could be found, it had to be taken. That paradox lies at the heart of this story, the courage of discovery intertwined with the cruelty of conquest. When we speak of 1492, we remember not only a sailor guided by stars, but also the countless voices that were silenced beneath those stars. The story of Columbus is not the beginning of America. It is the beginning of its awakening, its conflict, and its conscience. As the ships of Europe vanished into the horizon, the waves closed behind them, leaving two worlds forever bound by fate. This was not the discovery of a new world. It was the collision of two old ones, and from that collision, the long, tumultuous birth of America had truly begun. The naming of the continent Amerigo Vespucci. Prologue: the question that would not die. It was the dawn of the 16th century. The sails of European ships now crossed the Atlantic like clouds, carrying explorers, soldiers, and dreams of empire. The New World, as they called it, glittered with mystery, but a question still lingered in every royal court and scholar's study. What exactly had Columbus found? Was it India, as he claimed? Was it China? Or perhaps a chain of islands off its coast? No one knew. The maps of the world were trembling under the weight of discovery, and no one could make sense of it. Among those who dared to question the legend of Columbus was another Italian, a quiet thinker and observer, and a man whose name the entire world would one day carry: Amerigo Vespucci. The man behind the name. Amerigo Vespucci was born in Florence, Italy, in 1454, a time when the Renaissance was turning Europe into a workshop of ideas. He was not a nobleman, not a soldier, and not even a sailor by trade. He was a scholar, a merchant, and a lover of maps. He worked for the powerful Medici family, managing trade routes and learning the secrets of navigation. But like Columbus, he too was drawn by the sea, by the mystery of what lay beyond the western horizon. When news spread that a Genoese sailor had crossed the Atlantic and found the Indies, Vespucci's curiosity caught fire. Something, he felt, did not fit. The lands described by Columbus, lush, vast, filled with strange animals and people, did not match anything in Asia. And so, in the spirit of discovery that defined his age, Amerigo Vespucci set out to see the truth for himself. The Voyages of Vespucci. Between 1499 and 1502, Vespucci joined and led several expeditions to the coasts of what we now know as South America. He sailed under both the Spanish and Portuguese flags, mapping coastlines, observing stars, and recording every detail he saw. His letters and journals describe an astonishing world. Wide rivers broader than any in Europe, forests that seemed endless, constellations unseen in northern skies, and people, many different nations speaking hundreds of tongues, living in ways that seemed both strange and sophisticated. He wrote of Brazil, of Venezuela, of lands that stretched so far south they curved away beneath the horizon. It was then that realization struck him. This is not Asia, this is a new world, a new continent unknown to our ancestors. Vespucci's mind burned with the magnitude of what he had found. He had not simply reached a new route to the Indies. He had identified a new part of the earth, a new world revealed. Vespucci's account spread quickly through Europe. His letters, written with clarity and awe, were translated, copied, and distributed in cities from Lisbon to Nuremberg. They described not the coast of Asia, but an entirely separate land, vast, wild, and magnificent. He wrote of stars unseen from Europe, of climates that changed with latitude, of coastlines so long that they could not possibly belong to an island. He called this place Mundus Novus, the New World. To the scholars of the time, his argument was revolutionary. Columbus had opened the door, but Vespucci was the first to recognize that the door led somewhere entirely new. His words changed the way people looked at the planet. For the first time, humanity began to understand that the Earth was far larger and more diverse than anyone had ever imagined. The map that changed everything. In 1507, a group of German scholars working in the small town of Saint-Dié-des-Vosges published a New World map. Among them was a cartographer named Martin Waldseemüller. Waldseemüller and his team had read Vespucci's letters. They were struck by the Italian's reasoning, by his evidence that the western lands were a separate continent. And so when they drew their great map, they labeled this new landmass not as India, not as Colombia, but as America, in honor of Amerigo Vespucci, the man who had recognized the truth. The map, titled Universalis Cosmographia, was the first to show two separate continents in the Western Hemisphere. It was bold, it was revolutionary, and it would forever fix the name America in the human imagination. No king decreed it, no army enforced it. It was a choice made by scholars, by cartographers and thinkers who dared to trust the evidence of reason over the pride of power. The power of a name. At first, few noticed. Only 1,000 copies of Waldseemüller's map were printed. But ideas like winds travel faster than ships. Soon explorers and map-makers across Europe began to use the term America. It spread to atlases, books, and classrooms. And within a generation, America had become the accepted name for the lands across the Atlantic. Columbus had discovered the New World, but Amerigo Vespucci had defined it. It was his insight, and not Columbus's error, that gave identity to half the planet. Ironically, Vespucci never sought this fame. He never demanded that the continent be named for him. He was, in fact, unaware that his name had been chosen at all. The honor was given after his death, a quiet tribute from one mind to another, from scholars who valued truth above glory. A world reimagined. With the realization that a new world existed, the European imagination exploded. Explorers set out not just to find gold, but to chart geography. Scientists studied new plants, animals, and peoples. The Earth was no longer flat, nor was it divided simply between the Old and the East, and it was a globe filled with unknown wonders. Amerigo Vespucci's discovery shifted the very framework of human thought. It was no longer enough to believe in inherited maps and ancient texts. Now evidence, observation, and exploration defined truth. He had helped move humanity from the age of myth into the age of reason. And for that, his name, America, became not just a label on a map, but a symbol of discovery itself. The forgotten legacy. Ironically, Vespucci's fame would fade in his lifetime. He was appointed chief navigator of Spain, charged with training new explorers and maintaining the country's nautical charts. He worked quietly, methodically, never boasting of what he had accomplished. When he died in 1512, few celebrated him. The world still debated who truly deserved the title of discoverer. But history has a way of rewarding truth, even slowly. As centuries passed, scholars recognized the weight of Vespucci's insight. He had been the first to see what others could not, that the western lands were not an extension of Asia, but a new world altogether. Columbus found the shore. Vespucci found the truth. The meaning behind the name America. America. 6 letters that carry centuries of meaning. It stands for adventure, ambition, and discovery. But it also stands for contradiction, for conquest and conflict, for hope and heartbreak. When Waldseemüller inscribed that name onto his map, he could not have imagined what would follow. That America would one day become not just a place, but an idea. A dream of liberty, equality, and human possibility. A name that would rise above empires and define the modern world. And yet behind that grand name lies the simple story of a man who looked at the stars, measured the horizon, and dared to question what others accepted as truth. He is not naming a nation. He is naming a revelation, a new land, a new understanding, a new chapter in the story of humanity. And so it was that from one man's insight, the vastest of continents took its name, a name born not from conquest but from curiosity, not from power but from perception, not from Columbus's dream, but from Amerigo Vespucci's realization that the earth still held secrets yet to be known. Closing reflection. The name America reminds us that discovery is not about finding what we expect. It's about seeing what is truly there. Columbus sought India. Vespucci found a continent, and the world in turn found a new identity. Every time we say the word America, we echo a moment from 5 centuries ago, the moment when one mind dared to say, "This is something new." British colonization, the 13 colonies. Prologue, the tide of empire. The Atlantic Ocean lay like a mirror between two worlds, the old and the new. In the east stood Europe, proud and ancient, bursting with ambition. In the west waited a vast, untamed land, filled with forests, rivers, and endless possibility. By the early 16th and 17th centuries, the race was on. Spain had conquered the south. France had moved along the north and inland rivers, and England, small, damp, but burning with enterprise, turned its gaze across the sea. What began as a quest for fortune and fame soon became something far greater, the birth of a new civilization. Jamestown, the first footstep, 1607. In 1607, 3 small English ships, the Susan Constant, Godspeed, and Discovery, set sail from London, carrying 104 settlers. Their destination, a distant land known as Virginia, named in honor of Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. After months of hardship and storms, they reached the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, and then sailed up a river they named after their king, James. There they built a settlement and called it Jamestown. It was no paradise. The summer heat was suffocating, the winters brutal. Swamps bred mosquitoes that carried deadly disease. Food ran short, and within months half the settlers were dead. Yet those who survived refused to surrender. They learned from the indigenous Powhatan people how to grow maize, fish the rivers, and survive the seasons. The colony struggled, burned, rebuilt, and endured. And with the arrival of John Rolfe and his experiments with tobacco, Jamestown found gold of a different kind. Cash crops, not coins. Tobacco became the lifeblood of Virginia, the first profitable export, and England's interest in colonization grew stronger. The Pilgrims and the Promise of Freedom, 1620. While Jamestown represented enterprise, another group came seeking something deeper, freedom. In 1620, a small ship named the Mayflower carried 102 English men, women, and children, pilgrims, fleeing religious persecution. They landed far north of Virginia, on the cold shores of Massachusetts, where they founded Plymouth Colony. Before stepping ashore, they signed the Mayflower Compact, a brief but powerful agreement declaring self-governance and unity under God. It was a fragile beginning, but symbolic, for here lay the seed of a radical idea. A people could govern themselves, free from the will of kings. The Pilgrims endured a harsh winter, nearly half perished, but the survivors were helped by the Wampanoag people, who taught them how to cultivate corn, hunt game, and survive. The following year, they celebrated their first harvest, a feast of gratitude and peace that would later be remembered as Thanksgiving. The Pilgrims endured a harsh winter, nearly half perished, but the survivors were helped by the Wampanoag people, who taught them how to cultivate corn, hunt game, and survive. The following year, they celebrated their first harvest, a feast of gratitude and peace that would later be remembered as Thanksgiving. Expansion and diversity, the 13 blossoms. Over the next century, the English planted colonies all along the Atlantic coast. By 1733, there were 13, each distinct, each with its own culture, economy, and spirit. Let us travel briefly through them from north to south, to see how these settlements laid the foundation of a new nation. First, Massachusetts Bay, 1629. Founded by Puritans seeking religious purity, Massachusetts became a theocratic yet industrious society. Its people built schools, churches, and towns like Boston, where intellect, labor, and faith combined. The seeds of American education were planted here. Harvard College was established in 1636, the first institution of higher learning in the New World. 2. New Hampshire and Maine. Originally part of Massachusetts, These northern territories were filled with fishermen, trappers, and lumbermen, hardy souls living close to nature and far from royal control. See Rhode Island, 1636. Formed by Roger Williams, a preacher banished from Massachusetts for preaching religious tolerance. Here, freedom of conscience became sacred, a revolutionary idea that would later echo in the U.S. Constitution. 4. Connecticut, 1636. Built by settlers seeking more political independence, Connecticut drafted the Fundamental Orders, one of the first written constitutions in history. 5. New York, 1664. Once a Dutch colony called New Amsterdam, it was seized by the English and renamed for the Duke of York. Bustling, diverse, and cosmopolitan even then, New York was a place of traders and immigrants, the beating heart of commerce. 6. New Jersey. Split between Quakers and Puritans, it became a melting pot of ideas and ethnicities, a reflection of America's future diversity. 7. Pennsylvania, 1681. Granted to William Penn, a Quaker visionary who believed in peace, equality, and coexistence with native tribes. Pennsylvania's capital, Philadelphia, city of brotherly love, would later become the cradle of American democracy. 8. Delaware, a small but strategic colony with a thriving port, where Swedish, Dutch, and English settlers mingled. 9. Maryland, 1632. Founded by Lord Baltimore as a haven for persecuted Catholics, Maryland balanced faith and tolerance, another step toward the idea of religious liberty. 10. Virginia, 1607. The first and largest of the colonies, Virginia remained an agricultural powerhouse built on tobacco and the labor of enslaved Africans, a contradiction that would haunt America for centuries. 11. North Carolina and South Carolina. Developed from a single grant, these colonies thrived on rice, indigo, and trade with the Caribbean. They also became centers of plantation life, dependent on slavery yet rich in export wealth. 12. Georgia, 1733. The last of the 13, founded by James Oglethorpe as a place for debtors and the poor, a second chance colony designed to give new beginnings to the forgotten. The shadow of slavery. As the colonies prospered, a darker institution took root: slavery. Ships from Africa brought thousands of men, women, and children across the ocean in chains. They were forced to work on plantations under brutal conditions. This cruel trade enriched Europe and built the economic backbone of the colonies, but it also sowed moral conflict. For even as colonists spoke of liberty and freedom, they denied it to millions. This contradiction would later tear the nation apart, yet also drive it to redefine itself. Conflict and cooperation. Despite their differences, the colonies began to recognize shared interests. They faced threats from native alliances, French forces, and pirates along the coast. To survive, they had to cooperate. Trade flourished among them: timber from the north, rice and tobacco from the south, and ships from the ports of New England. Roads and communication grew, and slowly a sense of unity began to form. They were still English in name, but something new in spirit. Colonial Americans, a people halfway between subjects and citizens. The seeds of independence. England saw the colonies as sources of wealth, bound by loyalty and tax. But across the ocean, time and distance changed perspectives. Children born in Boston or Philadelphia no longer thought of themselves as Englishmen living abroad. They were Americans, shaped by a new land and new ideas. By the mid-1700s, tension simmered. The colonies had their own assemblies, their own ways of life, their own pride. The Crown's rules felt increasingly foreign. The taxes unfair, the interference intolerable. The same spirit that had driven the Pilgrims across the sea now whispered again, "We can govern ourselves." The first American identity. Within the fields, workshops, and meeting houses of the 13 colonies, a quiet transformation unfolded. Farmers, merchants, ministers, and craftsmen began to share a belief that this new land was not just an extension of England, but a place where destiny could be written anew. In Boston taverns, men debated freedom. In Virginia courtyards, planters discussed rights. Pamphlets spread ideas of liberty, natural law, and equality. And when war finally came, it would be these very 13 colonies, different yet united, that stood shoulder to shoulder to declare independence. Epilogue. From colonies to a nation. The 13 colonies began as fragile outposts, small dots of civilization along an endless wilderness. But within a century and a half, they had grown into a vibrant society of 2 million people. They built towns, governments, universities, and economies. They forged not only a nation, but an identity. Resilient, questioning, and hungry for freedom. The forests that once swallowed Jamestown echoed now with the words of revolution. And in those words, the world would soon hear the birth cry of the United States of America. But before that declaration, before the flag and the fireworks, there was the long, patient struggle of settlers, farmers, dreamers, and exiles who dared to build something new in the wilderness. Their story is not just about colonization. It is about transformation. It is about 13 scattered settlements becoming one destiny. The 13 colonies were not simply Britain's children. They were the architects of a new world, and the heartbeat of what would soon become America. The fire beneath the crown. The year was 1765. The cobblestone streets of Boston echoed with the heavy boots of British soldiers. Flags of the crown fluttered above every courthouse, every tavern, every heart that still whispered, "God save the King." But beneath the anthem, there was another sound, the murmur of discontent. For decades, the 13 colonies had lived under British rule, paying taxes, following orders, fighting in wars that were not their own. Yet now something was changing. People began to ask a dangerous question. Why should we pay tribute to a king across an ocean? The question spread like wildfire. It moved from Virginia's tobacco fields to New York's harbors, from Pennsylvania's farms to the bustling streets of Boston. The weight of taxes, a kingdom's grip tightens. When the 7 Years' War ended in 1763, Britain was victorious but broke. To refill its treasury, the Crown imposed new taxes on the colonies: the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and the Tea Act. At first, people thought it was temporary, but soon they realized, and this was no passing burden. It was control. The Stamp Act required every piece of paper, from newspapers to legal documents, and to carry a British stamp, a symbol of authority. The Sugar Act taxed trade. The Tea Act forced colonists to buy British tea only, even though cheaper options existed elsewhere. Ordinary citizens, blacksmiths, farmers, shopkeepers, began to feel the sting of invisible chains, and for the first time they spoke not in whispers but in unity. No taxation without representation became their battle cry. The spark in Boston, blood on the snow. In 1770, the tension snapped. A cold March evening, a group of colonists gathered in Boston's King Street, shouting at British soldiers who stood guard. Snowballs flew, then stones, then bullets. When the smoke cleared, 5 men lay dead. Among them was Crispus Attucks, a man of African and native descent. The first blood spilled for American liberty. The newspapers called it the Boston Massacre. But to the people, it was not just a tragedy. It was proof that British rule would stop at nothing to silence dissent. The Boston Tea Party, a night of defiance. 3 years later, anger turned into action. On a freezing December night in 1773, a group of men disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. One by one, they dumped 342 chests of British tea into the cold black water. The harbor turned dark with tea leaves and with rebellion. When news reached London, King George III was furious. He called it an act of treason. But in the colonies, it was seen as freedom's first taste. The Continental Congress, voices of a new nation. In 1774, delegates from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia. It was the first time so many had come together: farmers, lawyers, scholars, ministers, not as subjects of the crown, but as representatives of something new, America. They met in secret under candlelight. They debated, argued, prayed. Some still wanted peace. Others whispered the unthinkable: independence. John Adams wrote in his diary, "This meeting, if it succeeds, will change the course of the world." They sent a petition to King George III asking for fair treatment, not war. But the king ignored them. Instead, he sent more troops. The colonies realized, and their words had failed. Only action remained. Lexington and Concord, the shot heard round the world. April 19, 1775. British troops marched toward Concord, Massachusetts to seize colonial weapons. But at dawn, on the green fields of Lexington, they were met by a small band of farmers and militia, the Minutemen. A single gunshot cracked through the mist. No one knows who fired first, but that sound, that one echo, had changed history forever. The American Revolution had begun. As battles spread from Massachusetts to Virginia, the dream of freedom became a fire no army could extinguish. On the Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776, in Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress gathered once more. This time there would be no petitions and only a declaration. Thomas Jefferson, a young Virginian with a quiet mind and a sharp pen, was chosen to draft the document. For days he wrote in silence by candlelight. When it was finished, he read, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Those words rang like thunder through the colonies. They signed their names one by one. John Hancock the first, his signature bold and defiant. By doing so, they risked everything, their property, their lives, their families. For if the revolution failed, they would be hanged as traitors. But they signed anyway. The war for freedom, blood, hope, and sacrifice. The war that followed was brutal and uncertain. The British Army was vast and disciplined. The Continental Army was young and poorly equipped. In the winter of 1777 at Valley Forge, Washington's men suffered freezing cold and hunger. Many had no shoes. Yet in the fire of their suffering, a nation's spirit was forged. When France joined the war on the side of the colonies in 1778, the tide began to turn. Battles raged from Saratoga to Yorktown. In 1781, General Cornwallis of Britain surrendered at Yorktown, Virginia. The war was over. The dream had survived, and the birth of a new nation. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain recognized the independence of the United States of America. 13 colonies had become one nation. A fragile, newborn republic, imperfect, uncertain, but free. The people celebrated not with fireworks, but with tears, for they had paid a heavy price. Over 25,000 Americans had died. Yet from their sacrifice rose a flag, a constitution, and a new vision of liberty that would echo for centuries. Closing scene, the legacy of independence. As the sun set on that first 4th of July, church bells rang from town to town. Farmers left their fields, soldiers embraced their families, and children stared at the new flag fluttering in the wind. It was more than a victory. It was a beginning. Freedom was no longer an idea whispered in secret. It was a reality written in blood and ink. The world would never be the same again. And on that day, July 4th, 1776, the United States of America was born. The Revolutionary War, fight for freedom. The year was 1775. The wind over the 13 colonies carried the scent of rebellion. For more than a decade, the colonists had endured unbearable taxes, unfair laws, and constant control from a distant king, King George III of Britain. But now, the patience of a people was breaking. The streets of Boston, Philadelphia, and New York buzzed with whispers of defiance. Men gathered in taverns, women exchanged secret letters, and pamphlets spread like wildfire, calling for one sacred word: freedom. The spark of war. It all began on a quiet April morning in Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts. British soldiers, known as Redcoats, marched through the countryside with the goal of seizing hidden weapons and arresting rebel leaders. But the local militia, ordinary farmers and blacksmiths, stood waiting. A single gunshot broke the dawn silence. No one knew who fired first, but that shot became known as the shot heard round the world. It marked the beginning of the American Revolutionary War. The colonies, once divided by distance and culture, suddenly united under one cause. From New Hampshire to Georgia, men took up muskets and joined local militias. The cry for liberty echoed across fields, mountains, and towns. The birth of an army. In June 1775, the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia. Among them was a tall, reserved man from Virginia, George Washington. With his calm authority and proven experience, he was chosen as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. Washington's task was monumental. He had no professional army, little training, and scarce weapons. But he had one thing that the British could never crush: the will of free people. Under his leadership, volunteers turned into soldiers. They trained in harsh conditions, often barefoot and hungry. But their spirit burned brighter than any royal flag: the struggle and sacrifice. The first major test came at Bunker Hill in June 1775. Though technically a British victory, the colonists inflicted heavy losses, proving they could stand toe-to-toe with the Empire. Over the next few years, Washington's army fought not only the British but also the bitter cold, disease, and despair. In the winter of 1777-1778, at Valley Forge, thousands of soldiers shivered in torn uniforms. Food was scarce. Hope was fading. Yet Washington walked among his men every night, sharing their suffering, whispering words of encouragement. Out of that frozen valley rose an unbreakable army, disciplined, loyal, and ready to fight for the dream of a free America. The world takes notice. At first, the American colonies stood alone. But after the stunning victory at Saratoga in 1777, the impossible happened. France joined the war on the side of the Americans. Soon after, Spain and the Netherlands also lent support. What began as a rebellion had now become a global war. Across oceans, the great European powers clashed, reshaping the destiny of the world. The British found themselves overstretched, fighting on multiple fronts, far from home, against a people who refused to surrender. The turning point. By 1781, the war had dragged on for 6 long years. Both armies were exhausted, resources drained, and thousands of lives lost. But Washington's resolve never wavered. With the help of the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse and the army led by General Rochambeau, Washington planned a daring move: to trap the British forces at Yorktown, Virginia. Cannon fire thundered day and night. Smoke filled the sky as the Continental and French forces bombarded the enemy. After weeks of relentless siege, British General Charles Cornwallis surrendered. The impossible had become real. The most powerful empire in the world had been defeated by farmers, merchants, and dreamers, fighting for their right to live free. Victory and the birth of a nation. On September 3, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain officially recognized the United States of America as an independent nation. Tears, prayers, and fireworks filled the air. For the first time in history, a colony had overthrown its empire and won. George Washington, the humble leader who refused to call himself king, quietly returned to his farm in Mount Vernon. He had led his people to freedom, not for power, but for principle. A new dawn. The war had ended, but the story of America had just begun. The land was scarred, the economy broken, yet hope flourished. In every corner of the new nation, men and women dreamed of building something the world had never seen before. A government of the people, by the people, for the people. The Revolutionary War was more than a battle for land or liberty. It was a revolution of the human spirit and a belief that ordinary people could stand against kings, empires, and tyranny and win. That belief would echo through centuries, inspiring revolutions, reformations, and movements across the globe. Epilogue. The American Revolution wasn't just a war. It was a statement to the world that freedom once kindled can never be extinguished, that the courage of a few can change the destiny of millions. And so, from Lexington's first gunshot to Yorktown's surrender, from the blood-soaked fields to the halls of independence, one truth rang clear: freedom is not given, it is earned. The birth of a new nation, building the United States. On the aftermath of revolution, the war was over. The guns fell silent and the echoes of cannon fire faded into the winds of peace. In 1783, after 8 long years of struggle, the colonies had finally earned their freedom from Britain. But as the smoke cleared, a new question hung heavy over the land. Now that we are free, what kind of nation shall we become? The young America was not the grand superpower we know today. It was fragile, uncertain, and fractured. 13 states, each with its own government, its own currency, its own laws. The unity that had existed during war was now slipping away in peace. Farmers were poor. Trade routes were broken. The soldiers who had fought so bravely went unpaid, and there was no single national leader to guide the country forward. Freedom had been won, but stability was far from guaranteed. The weakness of the Articles of Confederation. After independence, the new states came together under a loose system called the Articles of Confederation. It was the first attempt to create a unified government, but the Articles were weak. They gave too much power to the states and almost none to the central authority. Congress could not collect taxes, enforce laws, or even raise an army. Each state printed its own money, creating chaos in trade and economy. If one state suffered, the others barely cared. It was as if 13 siblings were trying to live under one roof, with no parent to keep order. In 1786, a rebellion broke out in Massachusetts, led by a farmer named Daniel Shays. He and hundreds of war veterans protested high taxes and unfair treatment by local courts. This Shays rebellion shook the entire nation. It showed that the weak government could not even protect its own citizens. America was on the brink of collapse. Something had to change. For the Constitutional Convention of 1787. In May 1787, leaders from every state gathered in Philadelphia to fix the broken system. They met inside a stuffy, candlelit room in what is now known as Independence Hall. George Washington presided as the head of the convention, his calm presence commanding respect. Among the delegates were brilliant minds like James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, and Alexander Hamilton. At first, their goal was to revise the Articles of Confederation, but soon it became clear the system was beyond repair. Instead, they decided to craft something entirely new, a constitution for the United States of America. Over the summer, debates raged day and night. How much power should the federal government have? How would small states and large states share representation? What about slavery, trade, and individual rights? These were not just legal questions, they were moral ones. The Great Compromises. From the heat of those debates came the Great Compromise. The new Congress would have 2 houses, a Senate where each state would have equal representation, and a House of Representatives where seats would depend on population. Another compromise dealt with the painful question of slavery. The southern states wanted enslaved people counted as population to gain more seats in Congress, while the northern states opposed it. The result was the 3/5 compromise, counting each enslaved person as 3/5 of a person for representation. It was a tragic but political middle ground, one that left deep scars for future generations. At the birth of the Constitution, by September 17, 1787, the document was ready. 55 men had debated, written, and rewritten every line. They called it the Constitution of the United States of America. It was revolutionary in its design. Power would be divided among 3 branches: the executive, president, legislative, Congress, and judicial, Supreme Court. Each branch could check and balance the others, preventing tyranny. The Constitution was not perfect, but it was alive, flexible enough to change with time. When the delegates signed the parchment, Benjamin Franklin, then 81, looked at the carved sun on the back of Washington's chair and said softly, "I have often wondered whether that sun was rising or setting, but now I know it is a rising sun." America had been reborn, not as colonies, but as a united nation. the fight for ratification. But the struggle wasn't over yet. Each state had to approve or ratify the new constitution. Across taverns, churches, and town halls, fierce debates erupted. Two sides emerged: the Federalists, who supported the Constitution and a strong central government; the Anti-Federalists, who feared it would lead to another monarchy. To win hearts and minds, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay wrote a series of essays called the Federalist Papers, explaining why the new Constitution was essential. Gradually, one by one, the states voted yes. By 1789, the Constitution became law, and the United States officially had a government of its own. George Washington becomes the first president. In April 1789, in the city of New York, crowds gathered in celebration. On a balcony overlooking Wall Street, George Washington placed his hand on a Bible and took the oath as the first President of the United States. There were no trumpets, no royal crowns, no armies saluting a king. Just the quiet dignity of a man chosen by the people. Washington's first words to the nation were humble. "I walk on untrodden ground." He understood that every decision he made would set a precedent for generations to come. A nation in its infancy. The challenges were enormous. The country was in debt from the war. There were disputes over boundaries, taxes, and trade. Native American tribes still controlled vast territories. And Europe's great powers watched closely, some expecting America to fail. But the new nation moved forward with cautious optimism. The Bill of Rights, drafted by James Madison, was added in 1791, guaranteeing freedoms like speech, religion, and press. These 10 amendments became the moral backbone of the Republic. The building of identity. The 1790s were a decade of definition. Washington and his cabinet, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, and others, set up systems that still exist today. The Treasury, the State Department, and the Supreme Court. Hamilton's financial plan stabilized the economy, while Jefferson's vision of a free, agrarian society balanced ambition with humility. Political parties began to form. Newspapers debated passionately, and Americans started to see themselves not as Virginians or New Yorkers, but as citizens of one nation. The symbol of hope. To the rest of the world, America became a symbol, a place where people ruled themselves, where kings were replaced by ballots, where the idea of liberty was no longer just a dream. European philosophers, poets, and revolutionaries wrote about this American experiment. Some doubted it would last. Others believed it marked a new era in human history. A fragile but bright beginning. By the end of the century, the United States was still small. Just 13 states hugging the Atlantic coast with less than 4 million people. But within that small beginning burned a powerful promise that freedom and democracy could thrive together. The new nation had no grand palaces, no ancient traditions, only a parchment, a flag, and an unshakable belief in liberty. And though many challenges lay ahead, slavery, expansion, civil war, the foundation had been laid. A government of the people had taken its first breath. The world was watching. And the American story had only just begun. Westward expansion, the frontier, and the American dream. A nation hungry for land. The year was 1803. The United States was still young and a fragile democracy with barely 5 million people scattered along the eastern seaboard. But beyond the Appalachian Mountains lay a vast, untamed wilderness stretching thousands of miles to the Pacific Ocean. To most Americans of the time, it was a land of mystery and promise, a place where one could start anew, build a farm, and chase freedom under an endless sky. When President Thomas Jefferson negotiated the Louisiana Purchase with France in 1803, everything changed overnight. For just $15 million, America doubled in size, adding over 828,000 square miles of new territory. It was the single largest land deal in history, and it opened the door to what would be called the westward expansion, the Lewis and Clark expedition. Jefferson wanted to know what lay beyond those uncharted lands, so he commissioned two men, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, to lead an expedition across the continent. In 1804, with a team of explorers and one remarkable Native American woman, Sacagawea, they set off from St. Louis, traveling up the Missouri River toward the unknown. For over 2 years, they crossed plains, mountains, and raging rivers. They mapped the land, cataloged new plants and animals, and made contact with dozens of indigenous tribes. When they finally reached the Pacific Ocean in 1805, they had proven something extraordinary, that America's destiny truly stretched from sea to shining sea. Their journey wasn't just exploration, it was the beginning of a national myth, a story of courage, discovery, and limitless possibility. And the frontier spirit. As word spread of the fertile lands to the west, settlers began to move. Farmers, trappers, and pioneers packed their wagons with supplies, tools, rifles, and dreams, and headed into the wild unknown. The land promised opportunity, but it demanded everything in return. For every mile gained, hardship waited, storms, hunger, disease, and sometimes death. Yet these settlers pressed on, guided by an unshakable belief that the land belonged to those brave enough to claim it. Small towns sprouted near rivers and forts, trails carved through forests and across plains. The Oregon Trail, stretching over 2,000 miles, became a lifeline for tens of thousands seeking new beginnings. They called it the American frontier. But for the Native Americans who already lived there for thousands of years, it was the beginning of an invasion. The Native American struggle. Long before any Europeans set foot on American soil, Native nations had flourished. The Sioux, Cherokee, Navajo, Apache, and many more. They had their own systems of government, languages, and cultures deeply rooted in the land. But as the United States expanded westward, treaties were made and broken. Promises of shared land turned into forced removal. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, allowing the government to relocate entire tribes from their homelands to territories west of the Mississippi River. What followed was one of the darkest chapters in American history. The Trail of Tears. Thousands of Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole people were forced to march hundreds of miles on foot with little food or shelter. Over 15,000 died along the way. For them, westward expansion meant loss of land, of culture, of life itself. The gold rush and greed. By 1848, America's hunger for the West reached fever pitch. In California, at a place called Sutter's Mill, a man found gold in a riverbed, and the news spread like wildfire. Within months, tens of thousands of people, men, women, even children, rushed west in search of fortune. They came from every corner of the country and even from overseas, creating what became known as the California Gold Rush. Mining camps appeared overnight, towns grew from dust, and San Francisco exploded from a tiny port to a bustling city. But the gold rush also brought chaos, crime, corruption, and exploitation. Fortunes were made and lost in days, and once again, native lands were overrun, rivers polluted, and sacred grounds destroyed. Still, for many Americans, the gold rush symbolized something greater, that even in hardship, the dream of prosperity was possible. The iron roads of progress. As settlers poured westward, the need for faster communication and transportation became urgent. In 1860, brave young riders of the Pony Express carried mail across 2,000 miles in just 10 days. But their era was short-lived. By 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, linking the Atlantic and Pacific coasts for the first time. It was an engineering miracle, bridging mountains, deserts, and rivers, built mostly by immigrant laborers, many of them Chinese workers who toiled under deadly conditions. Trains carried goods, people, and ideas across the continent. The West was no longer remote, it was connected. The dream of a united America was becoming real. But progress came with a price. Buffalo herds were slaughtered, native communities were destroyed, and vast stretches of wilderness gave way to cities and farms. The myth and the reality of the West. By the late 1800s, the American West had become legend. Tales of cowboys, outlaws, and lawmen filled dime novels and theater shows. Figures like Wild Bill Hickok, Billy the Kid, and Jesse James became symbols of rebellion and adventure. Hollywood would later romanticize this era. Dusty towns, duels at sunset, and the lone rider chasing justice. But behind the myth was a harsher truth. The West was built not only on courage, but also on conflict, greed, and bloodshed. The expansion fulfilled dreams, but it also destroyed civilizations. Still, it created a shared belief that America was a land of endless possibilities where anyone could rise from nothing. Ooh, manifest destiny, a dangerous dream. In the 1840s, a new idea took hold. Manifest destiny. It was the belief that Americans were divinely chosen to expand across the continent, spreading freedom and civilization. It gave moral justification to conquest and colonization, but it also fueled wars and oppression. The Mexican-American War, 1846-1848, was one result of this mindset. The U.S. gained massive territories, Texas, California, New Mexico, Arizona, but at the cost of tens of thousands of lives. Manifest destiny was both inspiring and dangerous. It pushed Americans to dream bigger, but it blinded many to the suffering caused along the way. Ooh, the closing of the frontier. By 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau declared that the American frontier was officially closed. There was no more unexplored land to claim. The continent had been mapped, settled, and transformed. In just one century, America had grown from 13 fragile states to a vast nation, stretching from ocean to ocean. Cities gleamed with steel and light. The old wilderness had become the modern United States. Yet, as the frontier closed, a new question opened. Had America lost part of its soul in the process? Writers like Frederick Jackson Turner argued that the frontier had defined the American character: bold, restless, and independent. Without it, what would come next? The legacy of the West. Westward expansion remains one of the most powerful and complex chapters in U.S. history. It gave birth to the American dream, the belief that anyone, through courage and determination, could build a better life. But it also left behind stories of sorrow, of broken treaties, lost cultures, and environmental destruction. The prairies, mountains, and deserts of the West still whisper these stories. Every ghost town, every old rail line, every preserved native site holds echoes of both triumph and tragedy. Because the West was not just a place, it was an idea that shaped America's spirit forever. Ooh, epilogue, the dream that never ends. The story of westward expansion is more than history. It's a mirror of human nature. Our endless hunger for discovery, our desire to conquer, to build, to dream. Even today, that same spirit lives on. In space exploration, in innovation, in every person who dares to go beyond the known. The frontier may be gone, but the frontier spirit, the belief in possibility, still defines America. From the dusty trails of the pioneers to the cities that now rise where buffalo once roamed, the West reminds us of one truth. Progress always demands prelude to division. By the mid-19th century, the United States was no longer the small cluster of coastal colonies it had once been. It had expanded westward, annexing vast territories and building new states. But with that growth came an old festering question: slavery. Should slavery expand into the new territories, or should it be abolished entirely? The southern states, whose economies relied heavily on enslaved African labor for cotton and tobacco production, argued for their right to maintain slavery. The northern states, increasingly industrial and anti-slavery, pushed for abolition and the containment of the practice. This ideological divide began to rip the nation in two. In 1860, the election of Abraham Lincoln A man opposed to the spread of slavery acted as the final spark. To the southern states, Lincoln's victory meant the beginning of the end for their way of life. Within months, 11 southern states seceded from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis as their president. The Union, composed of the remaining northern states, stood firm under Lincoln, refusing to recognize secession as legitimate. The stage was set for a conflict unlike any the nation had ever seen. The outbreak of war, 1861. The war began on April 12, 1861, when Confederate forces fired upon Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. The cannon fire echoed across the continent. America was officially at war with itself. Both sides believed the war would be short. The Union had more men, factories, and money. The Confederacy, however, had experienced generals, strong morale, and home field advantage. As months passed, the war spread across countless battlefields, from Virginia's forest to Tennessee's hills. Thousands died in battles like Bull Run, Shiloh, and Antietam. The rivers ran red and the fields turned into graveyards. The human cost. By the second year of the war, both sides began to realize the immense cost. Families were torn apart. Brothers often fought against brothers. Farms were destroyed, cities burned, and hunger spread across the South. Women stepped into new roles: nurses, factory workers, even spies. African Americans, both enslaved and free, began to play a decisive role in the struggle. One of the most defining moments came when President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 4, 1863. This document declared that all enslaved people in Confederate territories shall be thenceforward and forever free. Although it didn't immediately free all enslaved people, it transformed the war's meaning. The Union was no longer just fighting to preserve itself, it was fighting for freedom, turning the tide, Gettysburg and beyond. In July 1863, the war reached a turning point at the Battle of Gettysburg, fought in Pennsylvania. Confederate General Robert E. Lee hoped a victory on Union soil would force the North to negotiate peace. But after 3 brutal days, the Union Army repelled Lee's forces, marking the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. Shortly after, Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address, a short but powerful speech reminding Americans of the ideals of equality and liberty upon which the nation was founded. That government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth, he declared. The speech became a timeless symbol of democracy and national unity. The final battles. From 1864 onward, Union General Ulysses S. Grant led relentless campaigns against the Confederate forces. In the South, General William Tecumseh Sherman conducted his infamous March to the Sea, burning crops, railroads, and cities in an effort to cripple the South's capacity to fight. By April 1865, the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia, fell to Union troops. General Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, effectively ending the Civil War. Just 5 days later, tragedy struck. The nation's savior, President Abraham Lincoln, was assassinated at Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth. The nation mourned as deeply as it rejoiced in its victory. Reconstruction, healing a broken nation. The war had ended, but the scars it left behind were deep. Over 600,000 Americans, Union and Confederate alike, had perished. Cities lay in ruins, and millions of newly freed African Americans sought to build new lives amid hostility and uncertainty. The Reconstruction era, 1865-1877, sought to rebuild the South and integrate freedmen into American society. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments abolished slavery, granted citizenship, and extended voting rights to African Americans. But progress was uneven. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan emerged, spreading terror to maintain racial hierarchy. Economic hardship persisted, and many freedmen became trapped in sharecropping, a system not far from slavery itself. Despite these struggles, Reconstruction marked the first major step toward racial equality and civil rights in America. The legacy of the Civil War. The Civil War redefined the United States. It proved that the Union was indivisible, that liberty and equality could not coexist with slavery. It strengthened the federal government, modernized the economy, and gave rise to a new national identity. Yet the wounds of the war, the racial divide, the questions of states' rights, and the legacy of inequality continued to shape American society for generations to come. Today, the echoes of that war still resonate in debates over justice, race, and unity. But through all its pain, the Civil War stands as the rebirth of the American nation, a phoenix, rising from its own ashes. Closing reflection. The Civil War was not just a conflict of armies. It was a battle for the soul of a nation. From the cries of enslaved people yearning for freedom to the letters of soldiers dying in muddy fields, it told the story of humanity's capacity for both destruction and redemption. When Lincoln spoke of a new birth of freedom, he envisioned a future where the sacrifices of the fallen would ensure that America lived true to its founding promise, freedom for all, a nation reborn from ashes. The end of the Civil War in 1865 left the United States, battered yet reborn. The dream of unity had survived, but at a terrible cost. The 19th century now stood before America, like a blank page, scarred but ready for rewriting. The smoke from battlefields had barely cleared when a new spirit took hold. A restless ambition to rebuild, innovate, and expand. The railroads stretched like veins across the vast land, connecting the Atlantic to the Pacific. Steam engines roared, telegraphs clicked, and cities began to rise like iron forests. America was learning to walk again, but this time with steel in its stride. The age of Reconstruction and industrialization had begun. The Industrial Revolution and the Age of Steel. Between 1870 and 1900, the U.S. transformed from a primarily agricultural society into an industrial powerhouse. Immigrants poured in by the millions from Ireland, Italy, Germany, and Eastern Europe, each carrying dreams of freedom and fortune. Factories hummed in cities like Pittsburgh, Chicago, and New York. Men like Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and J.P. Morgan built vast empires of steel, oil, and finance. Skyscrapers touched the clouds. Railroads connected every corner of the land, and a middle class began to rise. But this prosperity came at a cost. Workers toiled for long hours in unsafe conditions. Children worked in mills. Slums grew around factories. America's wealth was immense, but so were its inequalities. Still, the spirit of progress was unstoppable. Electricity, the telephone, and the automobile were transforming everyday life. In just a few decades, America had gone from rebuilding its cities to reshaping the world. Immigration, the melting pot. The late 19th and early 20th centuries marked the peak of immigration. Between 1880 and 1920, over 20 million people arrived at American shores. Ellis Island, near the Statue of Liberty, became the gateway to this new world. For many, Lady Liberty's torch was the first symbol of hope they saw after weeks at sea. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the famous poem read, and America answered. Though immigrants faced discrimination and hardship, they built the nation's railroads, factories, and neighborhoods. They brought with them music, food, language, and dreams. Slowly, the melting pot began to take shape, forming the diverse identity that defines the United States today. The world wars, from isolation to leadership. At the dawn of the 20th century, America was powerful but still looked inward. That changed with World War I, 1914-1918. Initially neutral, the U.S. entered the conflict in 1917, tipping the balance in favor of the Allies. When the war ended, President Woodrow Wilson dreamed of a world united by peace through his League of Nations, but the Senate refused to join, and America returned to isolation. Then came the Great Depression of the 1930s. Factories closed, banks failed, and millions stood in bread lines. Yet again, the country stood on the edge of despair until leadership and resilience revived it. Under Franklin D. Roosevelt, the New Deal created jobs, hope, and reform. But peace was short-lived. In 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor pulled the U.S. into World War II. This time, America did not just join the war, it led it. From the beaches of Normandy to the islands of the Pacific, American soldiers fought tyranny on two fronts. When the war ended in 1945, the United States stood not just as a victor, but as the leader of the free world. The Cold War, a battle of ideals. With the defeat of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, a new kind of war began, not of armies but of ideologies. The Cold War, 1947-1991, pitted the United States against the Soviet Union in a global contest between democracy and communism. There were no direct battles between the two superpowers, but proxy wars raged from Korea to Vietnam, from Cuba to Afghanistan. Nuclear weapons loomed as an existential threat, and school children practiced duck and cover drills fearing the bomb. Yet amid this tension, America soared to new heights. The space race ignited imaginations, culminating in Neil Armstrong stepping onto the moon in 1969, uttering the immortal words, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." The Cold War shaped not only America's foreign policy but also its identity, standing as a global beacon of liberty, culture, and innovation. Civil rights and social revolution. While the U.S. was projecting power abroad, it faced a moral reckoning at home. The 1950s and 60s brought the civil rights movement, a battle not for territory but for equality. Led by towering figures like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and Malcolm X, African Americans demanded justice, dignity, and the end of segregation. Millions marched, sang, and suffered. Many even gave their lives. In 1964 and 1965, the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act were passed, outlawing racial discrimination. The movement forever changed the nation's conscience. Alongside it came the women's rights movement, LGBTQ+ activism, and the push for equality across all lines. America was learning, painfully but persistently, to live up to its founding words, "All men are created equal." The digital revolution and global influence. As the 20th century drew to a close, America entered a new kind of war, not with nations but with time itself. The digital revolution reshaped life overnight. Silicon Valley became the new frontier, birthing giants like Apple, Microsoft, and Google. Technology, culture, and entertainment turned the United States into the epicenter of the modern world. From jazz to Hollywood, from NASA to the internet, American influence reached every corner of the globe. The 1990s brought unprecedented prosperity, but also new challenges. The fall of the Soviet Union left the U.S. as the sole superpower, but the events of September 11, 2001, reminded the world that even the strongest nation could be shaken. The 21st century trials and transformation. In the new millennium, America faced wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, economic recessions, political polarization, and deep social debates. Yet, amidst all turmoil, its democratic institutions endured. From the election of Barack Obama, the nation's first African-American president, to movements like Me Too and Black Lives Matter, America continued to redefine its ideals. The struggle for equality and justice persisted, but so did hope. Innovation didn't stop either. SpaceX launched rockets, AI began transforming industries, and renewable energy reshaped the future. America once again stood at a turning point, learning, adapting, and evolving. The eternal idea of America. Through centuries of triumph and tragedy, One idea has remained constant: the belief that freedom is worth fighting for. From the Mayflower to the moon landing, from the Declaration of Independence to digital democracy, the United States has been a living experiment, imperfect, yet endlessly striving toward a more perfect union. To the world, America represents possibility. To its own people, it represents responsibility. As the story continues into the 21st century, the nation stands not as a finished product, but as a promise born from courage, fueled by dreams and carried by generations yet to come. Ooh, closing note. The story of America is not just history, it's a heartbeat. It began with wanderers crossing icy bridges, grew through revolution, bled through civil war, and rose through innovation. And it continues. Still, every time someone believes they can make their own destiny, that truly is the origin story of America, a land forever being born.